Hello, and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm your host, David Battistella. Catherine Torpey is the executive director of the International Focusing Institute, with headquarters in Nyack, New York. She came to the Institute 2 years ago, when it began its transition from having been led by its founder, Eugene Gendlin, and his wife, Mary Hendricks. The Institute is an international cross-cultural organization dedicated to supporting individuals and groups worldwide who are teaching and developing felt sense focusing and its underlying philosophy. Catherine has been a practitioner of focusing for 20 years and is also an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. And joining me now is the executive director of the Focusing Institute, Catherine Torpey. Catherine, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of begin with your own story of focusing, and maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you came to focusing or how you discovered it.
Okay. You want the long version or the short version?
Whatever feels right.
I'll begin at the beginning, which is that I had a moment in my life where I was unhappy and happy, both. And there was just I had been in conversation with someone, kind of a counselor, and I remember driving home from that session with that person and being able to articulate as I was driving the deeply what it was that I was wanting. And I cried out to God and the universe, I want you to know me and to love me. This was the thing that was articulating what was deep inside of me in that moment. I want you to know me and to love me. This was the thing that I was really yearning for. And I kept repeating it over and over again. I want you to know me and to love me. I want you to know me and to love me. And it was just a very, very, very powerful moment for me. It was kind of a defining moment. And eventually, it was very emotional and sort of pulled over to the side of the road and just let myself be in that experience of articulating that. And then my life proceeded as it proceeded, but within a few months of that, I had moved from where I was in Oklahoma. At the time, I had briefly lived in Oklahoma, and I moved back to New York and started seeing a spiritual director, and she happened to be a teacher of focusing. I was just looking for a spiritual director, and she happened to be a teacher of focusing. And in retrospect, I felt and still feel that my ending up being with her was a direct answer to that prayer. Because what I found in speaking to the spiritual director, I remember her telling me, if you're searching for God, you're searching for your true self. It's the same thing. And so when I was crying out to to God or something external to me. I want you to know me and to love me. What I learned through focusing was I was also equally crying out to the deepest part of myself. I want you, Catherine, to know me,
Mm.
Catherine, and to love me. Because that's really what I experienced with focusing. That in fact, in the knowing to know me is to love me. um, and it's such a beautifully true thing in focusing. It's so genuine and shocking and surprising and delightful in focusing that to know is to love. And I often, when people don't know focusing, they want to know what focusing is. I'll often ask them, have you ever had that experience where there's somebody in your life, somebody you go to school with, somebody you work with, somebody in your family that you just don't like that person for whatever reason. And then one day, who knows, you get stuck in an elevator with them or something, or you share, there's some sort of shared trauma that you go through, or not even a trauma necessarily, but some shared experience, and you have a heart-to-heart talk with this person that you never would have sought out, but it kind of happens. And you have this heart-to-heart with this person, and suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I love this person. uh, and most people have had some kind of experience like that in their lives, where just actually getting to know someone well um, is an experience of coming to to love them. And I have found that over and over. So that's anyway. That's how I came to focusing, was through a spiritual director. So for me, this was 20 years ago or so, 1996 or so.
Mhm.
Um, and so for me, it's always been essentially a very spiritual practice. I came to it from a spiritual seeking.
Yeah, we sure do have those sort of moments of gratitude and reverence for the process. I know I've sort of experienced that personally as well. That getting to know oneself to the point where there's this sort of deep internal thing that happens that later sort of we describe as a shift or a felt sense, but something that really turns around inside you to fundamentally reset you, maybe is a way of putting it, inside who you are, or resetting yourself from the inside, um, just so that the way we move around in the world sort of changes from that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a reorientation or new relationship with something that was difficult.
And that journey that you began at that moment, um, it's landed you sort of at the center
Hmm.
of the Focusing Institute. And so, could you just tell me a little bit about the Focusing Institute and its origins and how you've seen it evolve, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so the institute was begun officially in December of 1985, um, and it came out of the work, of course, of Eugene Gendlin, who developed focusing out of his work at the University of Chicago and working with Carl Rogers. Um, and he wrote his book Focusing. Originally, it was published in 1978 and then went into paperback in 1982. And as he was teaching at the University of Chicago, and especially after he wrote this book, there were people wanting to learn not only learn focusing for themselves, but to learn to teach others focusing. And so it was decided that an institute would be a good way to make that happen. And it wasn't so much Gene himself who formed it, although he was very much uh, the head of the institute in, certainly the um, the intellectual head of the institute, but it was others around him that um, wanted to start an organization to maintain focusing, to promote focusing, to maintain its um, to make it findable, as Mary
Mm-hmm.
Hendricks, Jean's wife, has said, to make focusing
Mm-hmm.
findable. Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
kind of in that spirit of sharing that it all begins, where it's just this sort of natural evolution. It's not like someone who sits down and forms a business plan around a new method of doing something. It feels like focusing evolves much the way an individual's focusing path seems to evolve, which is this beginning of looking inside oneself and then carrying that forward as just a natural sort of way forward and a sense of rightness. Is that how you saw the Focusing Institute evolve?
Well, I wasn't there
Yeah.
to
Okay.
see it
That's
evolve, you
fair.
know. So I'm my yeah, what I'm telling is
Mm-hmm.
secondhand. But I do know from what I have been told and by the ethos around focusing that it was very important to Jean Genlin and those in the early days to have a spirit of allowing individuals to carry forward focusing in ways that felt right to them as individuals. It's a very something very important, I know, to Jean in particular, and that that the individual not be constrained. You know that your listeners will, if they know focusing, they'll be familiar with the term felt
Mm-hmm.
sense. That what's in that fuzzy, murky knowing inside of us, that focusing is intended to help articulate and bring into focus. That the individual's felt sense really needs to be supremely respected, and that real life comes out of that. And so we don't want frozen structures. We want a structure that's enough to maintain the integrity of focusing so that focusing doesn't become something sort of lost because everybody has their own idea of it. And so somehow the core of it gets lost. So we don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we want it to be findable. We want there to be a place that people know to go to. And the goal is to balance that with the freedom
Mm-hmm.
of people and teachers of focusing to follow their own felt sense around how to teach, what kinds of wording suits what they're teaching. And so there's all kinds of focusing now. There's whole body focusing, there's interrelationship focusing, there's domain focusing, there's bio-spiritual focusing, which is what I
Mm-hmm.
learned. And they're all various ways in to this felt sense that work for different people, work better for different people.
How do you feel Jean's philosophy informs the work of the Focusing Institute now?
Well, I am no expert in Jean's philosophy.
Neither am I.
um, yeah, there aren't a lot of us who are, so I have to have a big
Yeah.
disclaimer there that just because I'm the just because I'm the head of the institute, the staff, the top staff person at the institute, does not mean that I'm the expert in any aspect of
Mm-hmm.
focusing. I'm a true believer. I really, really believe in focusing, um, uh, I hope and believe that I bring a focusing attitude to my work, but I'm not I'm not the best teacher of focusing. I'm not the one who knows the philosophy best. I'm not in any way the expert in any of those fields. So that's an important disclaimer. I know that Gene. One of the phrases that people who do know Gene's philosophy well really bring up all the time is that we are interaction first. It's an important basic element to Gene's philosophy, which we usually call the philosophy of the implicit. That we are interaction first, that we don't exist separate from one another, which Gene would term a unit model. So an example is, lungs and air. The lungs don't exist without one. The one implies the other. Air implies someone breathing it in and breathing it out, and lungs imply that the air is there to breathe in and out. And so they're not really wholly. They're not separate units. The one exists with the other in kind of a perpetual state of interaction. I don't know if some of the philosophy experts would quibble with my wording, but but what's important is this non-frozenness. I think that that the philosophy underlying focusing is this always being ready for the new. When I first learned focusing, one of the things that I loved immediately about focusing is, as someone who had been in therapy and plenty of different therapy kinds of situations and small groups, and sort of as somebody who was seeking to understand myself and how to be a better person and how to manage my emotional life, and somebody who had been involved in all of that. What focusing brought for me was, in my experience of being in therapy was that it was somehow often about, identifying something that had happened in the past that had created a reaction in me, as though there were, some finite moment in the past that had created this reaction in me that was also somehow sort of permanent, that I now had to learn how to manage. And what I learned when I learned focusing was that when I go inside and notice the felt sense around any given situation in my life, like let's say I have a difficulty in my work life, something, I'm uncomfortable with my boss. I'm having difficulty with my boss. It's an uncomfortable relationship, let's say. In focusing, I would go in and find the whole felt sense of that experience, which may bring up memories, let's say, of a parent who that boss is, on some level reminding me of. But there's a lot more. There's all my wantings and yearnings. There's my experience. There's my bodily reactions. The felt sense is not just intuition. It's not just memory. It's not just physiological reaction. It's sort of all of those things. And that the moment I touch into that felt sense, what I so appreciated learning was that it'll usually move. It'll usually change it may change as soon as I look at it. The very act of looking at it may change it. And so again, it's not a fixed, there's not a fixed past that I'm trying to correct for, There's the past is living in me in the moment, and even my experience of the past can shift in a way that almost, makes my experience of the past totally different now than it was maybe 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
That resonates for you?
That does resonate for me. The way I describe that is an action block, or a part of us something that has been frozen in our past. And sort of we carry forward with that bit of us behind us, if we want to put it that way. And the moment we turn toward that, and the moment we come into relationship with it, and maybe more importantly, when that relationship is resolved, somehow that bit of us speeds to the present and becomes whole again.
Mm. So, wait, I want to take that
Yeah.
in. So, um, would you repeat it? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
that there, if there's a part of us, I'll give it as an example. Let's say there's something happened to me when I was 14 or something, and it's a sort of a dormant memory, but from that moment forward, I wasn't carrying forward as my whole self. There was that little bit was left behind.
So that little bit was left behind in that experience when you were, say, at 14. This something
Right. And the
happened.
rest of me
Uh,
doesn't carry forward with, because that part is not resolved, or it's been neglected or forgotten. But the very act of turning toward it and coming into relationship with it, when that relationship is resolved, that part speeds to you in the sense that it completes, it fills
that
you in a way.
that part speeds to
Hmm.
you. I love that. Feels so. That part speeds to you, and then you're fully in the present in a way that you had not been able to
Yeah.
prior.
Yeah. And
Is
then
that
it
right?
deepens the whole knowing of the self. So it's like, oh, right. When that happened, that's what it was. Oh, okay. And something that may have gone unanswered, or maybe even completely sort of submerged, becomes you again. It's a reconnection to these breadcrumbs of our lives sometimes that are left there. And sometimes they're left in relationships or experiences or disappointments or unfulfilled desires. All kinds of sort of, each one can be like, but what I've noticed is that as we encounter each one, and we take them in and we come into relationship with them, they move almost at light speed to become us again, so that
Yes.
our wholeness, we become more whole. There's something in that experience. Yeah.
You know, going back to my spiritual beginnings, and as you know, I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and so I have a lot of so biblical imagery comes to me um, quite easily, and when I first learned focusing with my bio spirituality with um, my spiritual director, I what you're saying brings me back to this idea of the the story of the prodigal son. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes, of course.
That the one son of the father had split his inheritance between two sons. The one son stayed at home and loyally worked, the with the family and with the father, and the other son took his inheritance and went off and spent it all. And the moment the father sees the son off in the distance returning,
Hmm.
the moment they turn toward one another, it's like exactly what you're saying. Like the past speeds, it just speeds toward wholeness.
Yeah.
There's nothing to talk about, and if you look at that story, it's the son rehearses in his mind what he's going to the prodigal son rehearses in his mind what he's going to say to his
Hmm.
father, what the conversation he's going to have with his father, to try to convince his father to allow him back in. But none of that is needed.
Mm-hmm.
There's no work to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the moment they turn toward each other, they embrace, and the other son can't understand
Yeah.
it.
And to put that in focusing
It's
terms, that's very often an
yeah.
internal experience where you've come into a
Mm,
relationship and something is being resolved and something else in you is saying, wait a second, what about me?
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. And that other part also deserves the same loving
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah. Yeah. The father isn't saying, I love you less. He's in that moment with the son who's returning. Yeah, it's a very lovely, lovely story. And here's that story from Luke 15, verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I'm dying of hunger. I'll get up and I'll go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands." So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his slaves, "Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has gotten him back safe and sound." Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, "Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who's devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fatted calf for him." Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead, and he's come to life. He was lost, and he has been found." Please tune in next time, when we will continue our conversation with Catherine Torpey, the Executive Director of the Focusing Institute. You've been listening to the Focusing Way podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. Please also check out our website at thefocusingway.com.